Now that you have a rudimentary idea of what's going on with the perspective grid here inside Illustrator, we're going to create a very basic perspective drawing. You should see the perspective grid on screen if you're working along with me. If you can't see it, go to the View menu, choose Perspective Grid, and then choose Show Grid. And then the grid will leap to life. One of the great things about the grid is that it works in harmony with the geometric shape tools. So armed with any of these tools, rectangle through star, you can draw directly in perspective onto the grid. The most obvious tool to work with, of course, is the rectangle tool. So I'll go ahead and select it or press the M key. Then I want you to notice this widget, which is by default located in the upper left corner of the illustration window. And it's showing you exactly which pane is active. So by default, the left grid is active. And notice it has a keyboard shortcut of 1. So you've got keyboard shortcuts of 1 through 4. You don't have to press Control or Command or anything else. And the reason I mention this, right now we don't need the shortcut. Later on, it'll become extremely useful when we start moving path outlines between panes. But at any rate, right now, the left-hand grid is active. The bottom of this cube takes you to the horizontal grid, which is the ground pane. And then the right side of the cube takes you to the right grid. And then finally, if you click outside the cube but inside this circle, then you deactivate the grid so that you can draw normally. In our case, we want to draw on the left grid, so go ahead and make sure that's selected. And then draw a rectangle like so. And notice that it comes in perspective, just totally awesome. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the fill to transparent up here in the control panel. So I'll click that fill swatch and I'll select none in order to get rid of the fill, just so I can see what I'm doing here. And then I'm going to draw a shape over here on the right-hand grid. But notice as I draw, I'm continuing to draw on the left-hand pane. Why in the world is that? Well, that's because that's what I told Illustrator I wanted to do, which is actually really great because you can extend your artwork in any direction you want, regardless of which pane you think you're drawing on. So I don't want that, obviously. I'll press Control-Z, Command-Z on the Mac to undo it. And I'm going to switch here inside the widget. I'm going to click on the right grid to make it active. It appears orange because that's the default color for that pane. And then I'll drag from here to here like so. And I'm trying to make sure I'm aligning this intersection point. If you're having a problem making things align properly, then just try dragging farther to the right or taking it in a little bit or what have you. Basically what's happening is Illustrator is snapping to the perspective grid. Now I want to draw a shape across the top of the steps. And to do that, I have to select a pane on the cube, but there is no top edge in the cube. There's just a bottom edge. Well, same diff. So the horizontal grid, the ground level, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same. It affects the bottom, the top of objects as well. Go ahead and click on it to make it active. It turns green because that's the default color of the ground panes. And then drag from here to here in order to complete your cube. All right, so that's a basic cube for you. That's all it takes. Now, let's say that I want it to appear as a kind of glass box that's holding my stairs. I want to get rid of some stuff on screen. I don't want all this falderall, especially the perspective grid. It gets in your face pretty quick. So there's a couple of ways to hide the grid. One is to go to the View menu and choose Perspective Grid and choose Hide Grid. And of course, that's a lot of work to get to that command. Here's an easier way, ostensibly. I'll escape out here. You're supposed to be able to just click the close box to close that widget just by clicking on Hide Grid, and that worked. Sometimes it doesn't work, in which case you've got to switch to the Perspective Grid tool and close it that way. All right, and then go ahead and grab the Selection tool. You can drag these paths around with the black arrow tool if you want to, but notice that they will not be in proper perspective anymore. Whether the grid is visible or not, it doesn't matter. It's just that the standard arrow tools do not respect the grid, so don't be doing that. Instead, I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that change. And I'll go ahead and shift-click on these other sides in order to select them. And I'm going to press Control-H or Command-H on the Mac to hide those edges. So again, I can better see what I'm doing. And I believe my fill is currently active, but I'll go ahead and click the fill in the appearance panel just to make sure. And then I'm going to select Fade to Black from the swatches panel, which is one of the default gradient swatches. And I'm going to expand the gradient panel, make a few changes here. I'm going to double click on this final color stop, and I'm going to change that color to white, and I'm going to increase its opacity to 100%. And then after pressing the Enter key or the Return key on a Mac, notice we now have an opaque box, so I can't see the stair thing inside. I'm going to go ahead and click at the midway point in this gradient in order to add a color stop to that location. I want it to have a location of exactly 50%, so I'll change that location value. Double-click on the color swatch in order to bring up the color panel. I'm going to change that K value to 50% just so that it's parallel. And I'm going to change the opacity to 0%, and then press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to get this effect. And I don't want a stroke, so I'm going to change the stroke here in the Appearance panel from black to none. And also, I'm going to click on the fill once again to make it active, and I should see an opacity value. If not, go ahead and twirl open fill. Click on opacity and change that opacity value to 65% in order to achieve this effect. I want an overall stroke that resembles the big strokes that we have around the isometric and perspective objects. And I'm going to achieve that by first grouping these objects together. So I'll go to the Object menu and choose a Group command, or I could press Control-G, Command-G on the Mac. And with my group selected here in the Appearance panel, I'll go ahead and add a new stroke by clicking this bottom left icon. And I want that stroke to be 3 points thick, and I'm going to move it down below contents, but that's not really going to make any difference. Notice that. Because we have these translucent fills, they're not adequately covering up those strokes. So I'm going to have to reconcile that. But first of all, I'm going to click on stroke and get rid of those strange miter joins by changing the corner to round join, and we get that effect. I'm going to zoom in here because I think we've got some hairline gaps going between these objects here. I don't think they reconcile quite properly. With the stroke active, very important, I'll go up to the Effect menu and I'll choose Pathfinder and I'll choose Add, which should do a virtual add so that we don't see any of the interior lines. And that actually worked. Oh, great. That's awesome. Everything's working out better than I anticipated. But if you've got some gaps going on, then what you do is you switch back to your Layers panel, twirl open the Perspective layer, and go ahead and lock down this item that's called Group that looks like the perspective stairs so that you don't end up hurting it. And then with the other group active, press Control-H or Command-H on the Mac in order to bring back your selection edges. And I'm going to press the A key to switch to my white arrow tool. And I'm going to click off the object to deselect it and then marquee these 3 intersecting points right there. And then I'll go up to the Object menu, choose Path, and choose Average. And once that dialog box comes up, I'll just go ahead and make sure both is active and click OK. And that'll go ahead and average the location of those points so that we get a nice seam. And actually, that looks pretty darn good. Just one more change I want to make. I'm going to switch back to my Appearance panel, and I'm going to double-click on Group to make the group active. Once again, that selects the entire group as well. Notice that. Click on Stroke, because I want to move the stroke out just a little bit. I'll go up to the Effect menu, I'll choose Path, and I'll choose Offset Path. And I'm going to enter a value of 1.5 points and turn on Preview to make sure it's what I want. It is indeed, and I'll click OK. Click off the object to deselect it. We've got a stair gadget rendered in perspective inside of a translucent perspective box that was drawn using the Perspective Grid tool here inside Illustrator CS5.